Now, South African tourists in Egypt were among those injured in an attack near the Giza pyramids on Sunday. The sites are regularly targeted by militants. The latest attack comes as Egypt prepares to host the Africa Cup of Nations. Will the attack affect the games, and what's been done to safeguard visitors and, of course, footballers? We speak to our Middle East correspondent, Paula Slier, who's on Skype with us now from Tel Aviv. Paula, very good evening to you. Now, have the investigations uncovered anything new about the bomb blast at the present moment?
No, at this stage, still nobody has claimed responsibility. The Egyptian media has been reporting that those behind the blast were, to quote, enemies of the state, aiming at destabilizing the security situation. A few hours after the blast last night, there was an incident in which Egyptian police raided and killed some 12 people belonging to a cell that's called the Hassan cell. It's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, for whom the Egyptian security are in a constant battle. But we did hear from the Interior Minister saying that these two incidents are not related. There's been a lot of assurances from the Egyptian authorities that the situation is calm, that this was a minor bomb, and that everything is under control. But of course, as you mentioned, it has raised concerns as to how safe the country is, particularly in light of the Africa Cup of Games that it is supposed to host next month.
Let's talk about the capacity. Do the authorities have the capacity to contain, the Islamist extremists themselves? And also, when you look at football within that country, there's been major problems with Egyptian football. We've seen, stadiums, the fans going onto the pitch and also assaulting players and so forth. Do they have capacity to control things like that?
About Islamic extremism, the two flashpoints really are the northern Sinai Peninsula. Here there's a strong presence of Islamic State, and every couple of days there's some kind of shootout between the Egyptian army and these extremists, and it's questionable whether or not the Egyptian army has a handle on things there. The other flashpoint is Western Egypt. This is desert, and it's alongside Libya, and there too they're struggling with insurgents. But neither of those locations is really going to affect the football matches next month. Essentially, what we're looking at is the security situation inside Cairo and other large cities. Here they do have a better handle of things. The big concern, of course, and this is a concern not just for the Egyptians, are the lone wolves. There was an incident, and this was the last major incident back in February, when a man on a bicycle detonated a bomb and killed 3 Egyptian policemen. Those kind of incidents are very hard for the Egyptian authorities to have a handle on. When it comes to football per se, of course, they're saying all the right things. They're saying that they have a handle on things. We've heard from the government and various ministers saying that this was not an intentional attack. There was some speculation, particularly in the Egyptian media, as to whether or not a South African bus was targeted as a message for the Africa Cup of Games. But looking at the bus, there was no signage on the bus that suggested that the tourists were coming from South Africa. So it is questionable whether or not it was targeting tourists per se. All we know really is that it was a bomb that was on the exterior wall of the Egyptian Museum that's slated to open next year. So the South African ambassador has been in constant consultation with the law enforcement agencies inside Egypt. In fact, the Egyptian tourist minister actually saw the injured South Africans off at the airport last night. So they will return to South Africa subsequently. And again, the official word from the Egyptian side is that they really are trying their best to contain the situation.
Now, Paula, this obviously will have an effect on tourist numbers coming into Egypt, because whenever anybody visits Egypt, you want to go to Giza, you want to see the pyramids, and we've had 2 attacks within that area in the last 6 months. Obviously, tourism is a major contributor to the economy in Egypt. How does this affect that?
It certainly is a major contributor. Something like 12 to 15% of Egyptians rely on the tourism industry. And the irony is that that industry was just starting to find its feet again. You'll remember that back in 2011, during the Arab Spring, and that was the Egyptian revolution, everything in the country deteriorated. I'm not just talking security, I'm talking welfare, I'm talking economy. And I was speaking to Egyptians throughout the course of today and yesterday, and many of them say that the situation in Egypt today is worse off than it was during the Hosni Mubarak years, and that was the former Egyptian president before the revolution of 2011. Egyptians telling me that most people today don't even have jobs. At least in the time of Hosni Mubarak, they had food. So in the context of that, this is a concern because Egyptians are worried that tourists who were slowly starting to return to the country will no longer come back. And this is why we see the country, and particularly the authorities, at pains to point out that they really do have the situation under control. I've been to Egypt so many times, and I can tell you from first-hand experience, there is a sense of lawlessness in many parts of the country. You don't necessarily feel safe, but it needs to be put in the context of international terrorism and the international security threats that many countries face. And again, because the Egyptians are so cognizant of this and they have an extensive police and security force that you see all over the major cities. And because of that, it's fair to say that they really are trying their best to try and encourage tourists and present the country as a safe destination.
Paula, a quick one for me, please. What's the latest on those who were injured in Sunday's attack?
17 people were injured, and most of them, as we know, were South Africans. The injuries were very light. They were from shattered glass from the one side of the bus where the small bomb, it was essentially a small bomb, fortunately, and not a large one, detonated. 3 of them were taken to hospital. 2 of them were suffering injuries to their eyes. They were in the hospital for a very short time. They have been released from hospital, and as I mentioned, they have all returned to South Africa. So fortunately, we're looking at only light injuries and nothing more serious that happened to the South Africans. The irony is that they were only in Egypt for one day, and they had just finished seeing the pyramid at Giza and the pyramids, and they were actually on their way to the airport when this happened. So after this incident, they were escorted to the airport by security and met there by the tourist minister, who was at pains to make sure that they were okay and wish those who had small injuries a speedy recovery.
All right, thank you so much, Paula Sleers, talking to us via Skype from Tel Aviv. All right, stay with us here. When we come back, we'll discuss the shortage of land in urban areas. The question is, can urban farming help resolve issues of food security? Inner city farmers say, yes, it can. We'll talk to them next. Stay with us.